Good evening. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks. Michael Hayes is really the person who will be introducing Ken Frampton. So according to him, I'm the warm-up act. So I will be just like literally a couple of minutes to welcome you all. It's really wonderful to see everyone here. And it's, of course, incredible and a very happy occasion to be able to welcome both Ken and Sylvia. This week, Ken Frampton and Sylvia Kowalski are the senior Loeb visiting Loeb fellows here at the GSD. As you know, it's been a few years since we established the senior Loeb program, and during this time, we've had people including Ulrich Beck, Arjuna Pudurai, Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen, David Harvey, Catherine Bow, Todd Williams and Billy Tien, Richard and Ruthie Rogers included in this program. And it's been a really fantastic opportunity for the school to have scholars come and spend a week and participate in different events. So getting both Ken and Sylvia is a special treat. While they're here, they're both going to participate in a number of events. In fact, Sylvia will give a talk tomorrow at 1 o'clock, which will be in the Gropius room. This talk is entitled Monument, Which Is Not One. And both John Peterson, who has been a co-host in this during this time, together with Michael Hayes, Silvia Benedito, and with great support from Sally Young. They're all going to be kind of participating, but tomorrow I think John and Silvia Benedito will also engage Sylvia Kowalski in discussion after her talk in the Gropius room L08. Also, there'll be other discussions and collaborations with the Art, Design, and Public Domain cohort here at the GSD, as well as meetings that Ken will have on Thursday with the third semester core with Eric Haller and others, and probably an event also with John May and the MDes students from the History and Philosophy of Design, as well as other sessions, I think, that will be held. And of course, the Loebs are the center stage for this. Some of them are here, sitting behind Ken, and they will be the beneficiaries of conversations, dinners, and things like that will take place also during the week. So please welcome Professor Michael Hayes, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohsen. This is a real honor, and in some ways it's very easy, at least part of it, because I've been following Kenneth Frampton's work, not as long as I can remember, but as long as I can remember well. So it was very important, very formative for a lot of us of my generation. It all seems so clear with hindsight. The journal Oppositions began publication in 1973. And in the first few issues, each of its editors issued a brief position-taking proposal that would be for both their interpretive agenda, but also for design practices that each of them would support in subsequent issues. So, for example, there were only three main editors then. Mario Gondozonis offered, it was kind of an amazing essay, Mario's too, offered a kind of semiotic triangle of the three dominant design trends at that moment. One of the first so-called semiotic analyses of architecture. Peter Eisenman followed characteristically with a corrective to Mario of how to understand his way, singular, right? And then, but before that, in actually the first editorial, Kenneth had offered a reading, the now famous reading of Heidegger's Building, Dwelling, Thinking essay. And it was that essay that, again, with hindsight, we now know inaugurated a career along with just a few others, Alan Cahoon, Mario, a few others, defined what we still call contemporary theory, contemporary architecture theory. And for that we thank him. Actually, I thank him because in fact, I wouldn't get a paycheck had he not written that essay. I'm the professor of architecture theory, right? The point is to claim for him that inaugural moment. Now, it was a decade later in this amazing collection by Hal Foster, The Anti-Aesthetic. This is where Craig Owens published Feminism and Postmodernism. It was one of the first feminist theoretical critiques. Frederick Jameson published the first version of what became the famous postmodernism essay. And Kenneth published what many regarded for a very long time as his masterwork, an essay entitled Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance. Kenneth called critical regionalism a category oriented towards certain common features that were already in place. That is to say, it was supposed to be a descriptive essay, or that was the claim. But at the same time, in practice and influence, critical regionalism was very much an aesthetic, if not an outright movement, which is to say it had a dimension that was not only descriptive, but courageously prescriptive. And I emphasize that because since that essay, no theorist of subsequent generations, mine own included, have really been so prescriptive as that essay turned out to be. I find that very interesting. It was like the very modernist avant-garde movements that Kenneth presumably was turning against. The essay was explicitly, this is not my word, it's Kenneth's rear guard. It was deliberately retrogressive, but future-oriented, and that dialectic for me is an important one. I think it might come back a little bit in the discussion tonight. That is, it sought to be descriptive of features of certain, what he regarded as authentic works of architecture as they already existed, but then went on to suggest, based on those, parameters for the production of future work. And this to me was the remarkable critical method, and it's something that many of us, I would say most of us, have attempted again and again ever since. But then by the 1990s, and I would say probably for most of the students here, the idea of an architecture of resistance came finally, and in some ways the success of the essay in terms of its influence on practice was also in some way began a kind of flattening. As it got more popular, it also got more flattened. The idea of an architecture of resistance came to be regarded not only as old-fashioned, sort of, this is 1990, sort of not .com enough, right? It was too anti-capitalist, it was too leftist. But more seriously, an architecture of resistance came to be regarded as impossible. That the desire for resistance was regarded as just a symptom, no longer it could be a prescription, it was just a symptom that reflected the pathos of a moment in which it seemed we would no longer be able to come up with alternative practices, progressive practices, practices of resistance. So all of this, and this is coming now for what to me was the crux as I was thinking about tonight, all this was in the back of my mind when Black in Design conference was launched just a couple of weeks ago. Black in Design announced its themes for this year: designing resistance, building coalitions. That really struck me. I immediately thought of the essay. I wonder if the organizers or the people who came up with the conference knew about the essay. What I saw in Black in Design, I'm still watching the videotapes, there was an amazing, in the face of the situation we're in, the enormous struggle we're in, there was an optimism and a desire to hope in the Black in Design conference that for me, given the legacy of a kind of critical negative thinking, has put Kenneth's essay in a very different light. Kenneth taught us ways to think in architecture of resistance, but it occurred to me as I put these two instances together that Kenneth also taught us something that we didn't recognize at that moment that maybe we're recognizing now, that architecture's relation to the world must not only be resistant, subversive, adversarial, although at moments it has to be that too, but architecture is actually quite generous. It can also amplify, replenish our desire to get things right, amplify the attempt to design in an actively liberatory and transformational way. And that's a part of that early essay that I think we weren't cognizant of. We couldn't see it that way at the time. Design can be quite generous. It offers a more capacious vision of our world that might be able to do better justice to what I think is the enthusiasm and the energies that actually bring our students here in the first place to architecture and design. And for that, we thank Kenneth. Welcome.
Thank you. Amazing. Well, I want to thank a few people, of course, above all, Dean Mostafavi, who invited jointly Sylvia Kolbowski and myself to be senior Loeb fellows, and then I should also thank John Peterson and Sally Young, who are inseparable from the Loeb Fellowship and who organized our stay here and all the logistics, etc., and welcomed us this afternoon. And finally, I would like to, of course, thank Michael, an old colleague, for his very, what can I say, rich presentation of my past sins, and also this challenge to address this evening the idea that architecture can be transformational and liberative as well as resistant, and I will try and honor this angle, so to speak. Yes, well, I'm well aware that here at the GSD I am on hallowed ground in more ways than one, for this was the cradle of urban design, qua urban design, I think, Grasa Jose Luis Sert, and it's also, in a sense, the birthplace of landscape architecture, in as much as, if I'm not mistaken, the first degree in landscape architecture in the States was inaugurated here by Friedrich Law Olmsted. More recently, it's also been the cradle of landscape urbanism, by virtue of the work of Charles Waldheim, conceived, I think, as a mediatory ecological strategy which has been variously pursued in the States and elsewhere since, I suppose, the mid-90s. As is fairly well known, this last has its ultimate origin, I believe, in the teachings of Ian McHarg in the University of Pennsylvania, Waldheim having been, if I recall correctly, the pupil of James Corner, and Corner, in his turn, having been the pupil of McHarg. My theme this evening, Megaform as Urban Landscape, has something of its origin half a century ago, when my initial experience of, for the first time, I think, of the urbanized region of the scale of the Boston-Washington corridor was sort of impressed upon my mind by actually taking a helicopter from Newark Airport at 5 on a summer's evening or early fall evening, back to Kennedy Airport to go fly back to London. And I'd never seen so much electrical power, this is mid-60s, or gasoline burning before my eyes as sort of like one of those sublime panoramas that you're never likely to forget. where there are two things actually that coincided at this time. One was this experience of the urbanized region, and the other was Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, from which I will never, which first appeared in 1958, and for which I will, I think, never really recover in terms of the way she influenced my total attitude to architecture and to life in general, I think. Where the first, the urbanized region, made me aware of the process of continuous, never-ending urbanization, the continual assembly of totally unrelated freestanding objects. The other introduced me to the provocative phrase, the space of human appearance, with all the political and cultural connotations that this implies. And thus I first became preoccupied with something that has haunted me ever since, namely that by what means, both as a society and as a profession, may we hope to be able to maintain spaces of human appearance within an exceptionally privatized and highly commodified process of unending urbanization, in which, as Mies van der Rohe once put it laconically in the mid-50s, I quote, "That is why we can't build cities anymore, old cities, planned cities. It goes on like a forest, and we shall have to learn how to live in the jungle and even do well by that." This is the mid-50s. Coming here on the plane, I happen to have it with me, for obvious cribbing reasons, Charles Waldheim's 2006 Landscape Urbanism Reader. And I opened the page at Graham Shane's pithy essay, which carried this image by Cedric Price, one of Price's typical witty legacies, with 3 states of urbanism represented by a boiled egg in terms of the antique and medieval city surrounded by a wall. Of course, that's a bit too three-dimensional for the other two, but in any case, the wall, of course, being the shell of the egg, boiled. Then, of course, the fried egg being 17th to 19th centuries, and then scrambled eggs being the 20th century, and of course, also the 21st century. And the fried egg sort of obtaining for the 17th and 19th centuries, as you can clearly read. So I am going to, I'm going to sort of give you an account of how I came to sort of get involved with this question of megaform as urban landscape, which is, of course, a coinage of my own, and which is needs a certain elaboration, I think. So it starts for me, in 1978, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, that now kind of unbelievable sort of offbeat, miraculous place founded by Peter Eisenman. In '78, with Stanford Addison as editor, the Institute produced a book called On the Streets, published by MIT Press. And various characters hanging around the Institute, and some also here in Cambridge, contributed articles to that anthology in a way, rather large anthology. And I contributed a piece called The Street as Continuous Built Form. And when I thought about presenting this issue this evening, Megaform as Urban Landscape, I thought maybe I should step back and talk just briefly, very briefly, about the continuous street as built form. And this, of course, is the Smithson's Golden Lane, montaged onto bombed-out Coventry. It's 1952 when Golden Lane was, when they first were premiated in the Golden Lane competition for housing in London. And here, of course, it's applied to Coventry as literally that, as a continuous built form. And it also contains a street. In '61, almost a decade later, they would do this London road study, and here one notices, it's not a street, but it's a kind of it's a spine which has an autoroute in it, and designated bus lanes and parking underneath, and also a kind of shopping mall. And of course they would even coin the term land castles. This thing, of course, produced land castles almost by itself, because it would divide certain sectors of the city from the next. But this preoccupation with roads and streets, I think, and it had an old history, and I will try and show it very briefly during the course of this discussion about Megaform. When architects, I think, well, of course, I am thinking of Le Corbusier at the end of the 1920s, began to think, that the only, what can I say, sort of modern, reliable civic work that would actually mark the landscape and define it was, in fact, the autoroute, which begins, of course, with his Planobus of 1929. And so that, at one scale, that was Smithson's preoccupation. As another scale, it was the street as the elevated street, which they also, I think with considerable naivete, thought to compare to, the street, the traditional street, the traditional double-sided street. Well, and this clearly was not the traditional double-sided street, and also, of course, it was totally disconnected from the urban fabric. Of the same generation, of course, this is a work by Shadrach Woods. It's in fact Shadrach Woods' Karlsruhe, and there, of course, he's trying to come to terms with the real problem for all streets once the automobile arrives, is how do you accommodate both pedestrian movement and the space of appearance in a street charged with automobiles. Of course, in the early 50s, streets were not so charged with automobiles as they are now. But this project in Karlsruhe, which is somewhat later, where he tries to put, parking behind the whole urban development, which is really addressing this linear street in the center of Karlsruhe. And he would develop that further. Well, here you see that this is the point of the active street with the residences on the street and the quiet perimeter block interior to which the cars would be attached. So I'm, by implication, of course, automobile-free, in theory, of course, never built. And but he would develop it into another project, which I think is more interesting, for Hamburg's steel soup. There again, this is a street as continuous built form, with parking garages brought in behind it. Also, not realized. And we'll go on with things not realized, but in terms of continuous built form, the street as continuous built form realized, of course, there is the much more concrete and realized, also pre-automobile, of course. This 1917 plan by Berlage for Amsterdam South will get built out. This is, I think, Amsterdam South in 1934, where the perimeter blocks, of course, create streets. And again, cars, the mass ownership of the automobile at that date in Netherlands simply doesn't exist. And this led me to be interested in a project like this, for example, also part of the same idea of the street as continuous built form, which is Barton Myers and Jack Diamond's building for the University of Alberta in Edmonton, where the Galleria as a continuous internal street is adapted to student residences. Sorry. And, well, this is a section. And of course, the odd thing about that is that typologically, the Galleria is a parasitical type that's sort of woven interstitially into the urban fabric. But here, they're borrowing the type and making it into a freestanding building. So this is not only the street as a continuous built form, of course, pedestrian street only, but a building, as it produces its own kind of unique building, which is probably, well, the greatest thing about it, of course, is discontinuous from the rest of the university campus. So that was a sort of prologue for me, and I thought I would indulge in it here just to show you that I have been nursing something like this in my head for quite some time. This, of course, is Reyner Banham's megastructure, and of course brings up the issue, what is the difference between megastructure and megaform? In fact, on the front cover of this book is Archigram's plug-in city, and of course I think the main issue, of course, is that Banham is stressing the structure rather than the form. The avant-garde structure, one might say, And this actually, Banham's megastructure comes out in '76, and a big feature early on in the rather elaborate text in that book is Paul Rudolph's Lower Manhattan Expressway Project, 1970, which never gets to be built, fortunately. One of Robert Moses's last sort of masterpieces, I suppose, And but more interesting for me is this, Hans Hollein's 1964 aircraft carrier, which is very definitely a megaform, in my opinion. And also, one of the attributes of a megaform is, of course, its landscape potential, I think, which I, in putting this argument forward, I think is important to. Well, there's a great remark made by Françoise Choet where she says, the autoroute system, if it were not for graphic signs, would not be negotiable at all. It's a self-evident truth. But unlike, the traditional city or the medieval city, where you could, of course, negotiate through landmarks, and I think this question of that aspect of the megaform to function as a landmark is perhaps one of its virtues. And you see that part of the accommodation is very interesting, the kind of double way he shows it. He kind of sinks the aircraft carrier into the ground, and the actual body of the building itself is subterranean. Fumihiko Maki is very much involved with the idea of megastructure. He publishes a text with Georgi Kepes that a project for Shinjuku, where the megaform is in fact, of course, a vast podium on which you can build virtually everything. And needless to say, the Rockefeller Center is also a megaform. Well, perhaps one of the most remarkable megaforms in relation to a piece of historical fabric by then, in relation to the gridded city. It has this relationship to the gridded city. The extraordinary thing is the breakdown of the form to the scale of Fifth Avenue. And there are early examples, and I've often sort of nursed the idea of trying to make a comparison between, say, the Palais Royal, in the middle, well, at the end, let's say, most complete, as we know it now, by the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, in the center of Paris, definitely a city in miniature, much more a city in miniature, in fact, than the Rockefeller Center would ever be, because nobody actually ever lived in Rockefeller Center, where in the case of the Palais Royal, people lived on the perimeter. In fact, the Palais Royal was developed twice, because it was first this enclosure, and then there was a second layer built. It was first built by Cardinal Richelieu, and in the 17th century. And within the Palais Royal, of course, there is then the Galerie d'Orléans, which is, you know, the idealized arcade, the internal street that we see here, you know, the internal street marketing luxury goods. And but the Palais Royal was also something else. It was also it was a kind of free port inside the city, a kind of free trade center basically, and also a political center. It was a place of subversive journalism, conversation. As someone once said, it was the place in which anything under the rubric of commerce could be conducted, including, of course, prostitution. And also the revolution begins there with Camille Desmoulins in 1789, shown here, urging the rebellious populace of Paris to revolt, to start the revolution, in fact. And here, 1815, you know, other kinds of commerce, you know, just at the moment that Napoleon is about to be defeated at Waterloo. But the idea of a perimeter block as a kind of enclave is one way of interpreting the idea of megaform. And here, Ferdinand Bouillon in 57, I think, produces this block in Algiers called 200 colons, 2000 colons is his nickname. And, well, you know, it immediately creates a place against the chaos that surrounds it, some of which, of course, is also designed by him. Or this, which is 1917, Hans Polzig. It's a House of Friendship competition for Istanbul, to be paid for by the German government. In fact, never built. But here, you know, the idea of megaform, I think, well, it may be even kind of shocking, since it's obviously competing with the minarets of major mosques, you know, and you see it here with, you could say it's also by Polzig an example of German expressionism, which clearly was not only just because of the site, but you look at other work of Polzig at this time, influenced by Arabic, or you could say Islamic architecture. And then I've already alluded to this, or I began to allude to it, which is the 1929 project of Le Corbusier for Rio de Janeiro, which is this, where, you know, he posits the idea that the congestion of Rio, you know, is such that the only way of liberating this congestion is to actually build an autoroute that, you know, irrigates the entire complex, and you put the automobiles on top of the building and stack apartments beneath it. And another version of the same. And then, of course, it becomes the inspiration for Plano Bus for Algiers of 1930, where, in fact, the autoroute now is, well, it is, again, on top of the long snaking block entering into the center of the complex, and then in the middle of the adapted Auradon blocks here. So, you know, he's actually sort of, that's the point, I suppose, about megaform, is that he's actually turning it into a, yes, into a landscape, really, into an urban landscape. And something of the same will be played with by Jacob Backemer in his project for Tel Aviv, where he will really kind of adapt the Corbusier notion to create a new center for Tel Aviv at the port of Jaffa, This is actually Dizengoff, the existing Dizengoff circle, slightly augmented, and also bringing autoroute into the whole system, multi-level autoroute. Again, trying to. This is the famous white city of Tel Aviv. 5-story walk-up, white cubic houses, mostly designed by German immigrant architects. Looking a bit like that in Axo, and here you see the attempt to the argument about scale. Trying to relate, the autoroute, and again, to consider the autoroute the most generative element, but not to stand by itself, but to energize a total complex. And he will, a few years later, apply the same thing to Amsterdam, so-called Pampas plan, never built, of course. You could compare it certainly to the Metropolis in Japan, building on the water, above all Kikutaki, but also to Tanguy's Tokyo Bay of 1960. Perhaps that's the important thing. The Tokyo Bay, as it were, has the nerve to build out into the water. And it's clear from Kansai Airport that the Japanese do know how to build out into the water, Artificial ground, of course, which is what Maki had been proposing for Shinjuku, there, of course, on dry land. In the case of the Kansai Airport, Renzo Piano, actually, the reason why the Japanese built out there, that's very interesting, in terms of public opinion, is because the pressure not to have jets taking off in the middle of Kansai, in the middle of the Kansai district, was such that they were forced, in fact, to build the new airport out in the water. And there, technical problems include having to jack up the buildings all the time because the artificial ground is, in a sense, always sinking. God knows what happens with the current emerging climate change, and the airport is probably no longer advisable as a technique. But this is also Pampas plan. It shows, the relationship, of course, with the existing Amsterdam and the way in which he would have carried out the expansion. Definitely a megastructure, you could say, but I think it's the form that intrigues me, the continuity, the horizontal continuity of the form. And then there are building types, and I will come back to this at the end. I think there are certain kinds of programs, which singular programs, or anyway, hybrid programs that lend themselves to this strategy in a way, because I suppose I am putting it forward as a hypothetical strategy for overcoming the problem, the aporia, so to speak, of urban design and urban planning. I remember being in this building, no, maybe in the old one, but it's a long time ago, listening to Jose Zoltan say, well, what will become of surgery if it's never practiced? This was a conference on urban design, And, all right, Jose Luis was able to achieve some remarkable pieces of they were, that's the important thing, I think, they were always urban interventions. And I'm playing around with this Megaform as urban landscape idea, also with the idea of intervention, that the real option is to intervene in the unending megalopolis of chaotic, freestanding objects, none of which are related to any other object. And so that's what's lying behind this. I think I have to admit it's some kind of obsession in a way. But then I think there are certain types, for example, above all stadia, which lend themselves to being rendered as though they are landmarks. And this one in particular, which is 1953, Vogel-Wiedplatz in Vienna by Alvar Aalto, where the the building itself takes on the character of a kind of escarpment or mini mountain, you know. And that thing is formed, of course, by the, well, here you see it, it's formed by the structure, the catenary structure, designed, as a matter of fact, by his engineer's son. And, I think it wins the competition, but of course it never gets built, as is often the case. I mean, here, the space of appearance, by the way, is not only inside the arena, but also in the forecourt here, and of course in all the other, it's a kind of mini Olympic intervention, you know. And Alto, okay, so, you know, another program is, of course, the roadworks themselves, or parking in the center of the city. And this is about the same date. It's a project for Helsinki, for the Turku area in Helsinki, next to the railroad entry into Helsinki and into Elo Saarinen's terminal. And then this is his, well, what he makes this into a kind of total landscape, the autoroute entering into this terraced operation here is concentrated parking made into a landscape. You see it here. Actually, if you know the city, that's the sort of National History Museum. And here is the Saarinen terminal, and this is the autoroute entering into the thing. The rails are here, and these are the terraced mass parking garages. More of the same. This is the existing lake, rails, autoroute coming in. This is the National Museum. That's the Parliament. And these are, and the only one building he built of this, of course, is Finlandia, the concert hall. Otherwise, none of this was carried through. But the idea was, of course, a kind of cultural band looking out over the water. So we come to Arthur Erickson, Vancouver. Yes, the university just outside Vancouver, the Simon Fraser University, which is built on a kind of natural acropolis outside Vancouver, and which he handles as though it is an acropolis. And so now, of course, we come to the university as a potential program for Megaform. And you see it very much here. Here, of course, my famous space of public appearance, right? And various faculty buildings creating another space at a higher level. And you see how the whole complex, of course also including parking, climbs up the site to this ultimate kind of monumental courtyard. This is the section in the other direction. So it's built on a kind of natural acropolis, the character of which it amplifies, you know. A kind of galleria space almost. And more, you're inside, underneath this space frame roof, which you saw, which was sketched out here and built out here. It's an architect that, I mean, I think has never been, to be honest, I think he has never been given his due. And I'll come back to him, I think, a little later, also in Vancouver. Then we come to, well, here we are, Robson Square, which is, in this case, the program is a law courts and a municipality made into a new synthesis with a landscape that is literally implanted on top of it, including these two waterfalls and this sort of stepped walkway. In fact, the uncomfortable coinage is the word stramps, combining ramp and steps together. And the landscape designed by Cornelia Oberlander, who is the third woman to graduate from the landscape architecture department in the GSD, along with Dan Kiley and Garrett Egbo and somebody whose name, I think, Jim Rogers, I think, 3 males and 1 woman. And she has always worked with, well, he's no longer alive, but until his death, she collaborated with Ericsson. And I value this thing enormously because, in fact, it creates a new spine for Vancouver. It almost functions, I think, in the intensely developed Vancouver. This is 86, you know, some time ago, as a kind of new spine in performing a function not unlike that of Rockefeller Center, I think, in New York. And here you see the space frame roof over the, these are the law courts, in fact, here. This is a kind of common public foyer. And then underneath is the municipality. And the municipality, of course, extends out, the whole thing ending in an existing Beaux-Arts building here, finally stepping down to this building. A plan of the same thing. I mean, here's the Beaux-Arts complex, and here are the tramps coming down, and you can see how this whole thing is landscaped. Yeah, these are the stepped ramps. More of the same. And in Switzerland, we encounter something similar. This is Luigi Snozzi and Mario Botta. I think this is 1972. It's a project for the main rail terminus in Zurich. At the time, it only consisted of the old 19th century building and these covered platforms. But they, or rather, yeah, I think we could say they proposed building this sort of new facilities for the rail and some side development here, air rights. And it's interesting, you know, that this rail thing comes into the terminus and breaks this, or goes over, of course, this small tributary to the Limmat. And then they build this building and they put trees on top to, somewhat naive also, to echo the line of trees on either side of this, to create a kind of landscape, a link, you know, to repair in a way the rail cutting by putting a bridge over it. I mean, of course, I'm showing you things that were both built and unbuilt. This, perhaps not surprisingly, was not built, and that's well. Now the interesting thing, not self-evident, is that this is a parking garage here in relation to this new office facility. So it unites, you know, the kind of 20th century infrastructure of automobile with the rail infrastructure. I mean, the Swiss are very good at this. I mean, I've never seen anything more ingenious and brilliant than the link between Cloten Airport in Zurich and the total Swiss railway system. You know, it's extraordinary connection, which also depends on an extraordinary Swiss invention, which is a luggage cart that will clip onto an escalator. No one else has copied it. I find it unbelievable, but that's the fact. You know, somehow I suppose the patent rights are too heavy. I don't know. Well, here you see the parking garage rather clearly, I think, and the existing covered platforms, the rail system entering. And then 2 years later, they do this for Perugia, which is to a regional administration building, to build the building as a viaduct, actually. It's an office building. But of course, with courtyards, it's definitely a megaform, and at the end of the megaform are these parking silos, and the teleferico leads you up to the hill town. And in a way, this long viaduct block, creates a kind of, that's the other point about it, a kind of order within the chaos of ill-related freestanding objects that surround the foothills of Perugia. And here we see the idea, which also is related to, a major autoroute. This, in this case, built the northern zone, from which it gets the term Zen. The Zen block by Vittorio Grigotti and Franco Purini in Palermo, and where they, and here we have, megaforms in the term, in the form of residential blocks that create a new texture in the landscape entirely. You see the blocks here. They in fact create a new domain, a landmark, in fact, you could say, against the chaos of the development of Palermo. And yes, I think it's one of the finest. I think it's suffered from bad maintenance, but I think it's one of the finest housing schemes that Grigotti or Associati would produce. And Purini at this date is closely connected to Grigotti, and the two of them together designed this project for the University of Florence. But it's the same idea, of course, only now it's not housing, it's faculty buildings. And they, of course, establish a new landscape. And are kind of, in my view, megaforms. And you see the idea in this model, I think, rather clearly. And this will lead to this built work. And here, this is something I think really, well, I personally think Vittorio Grigotti is, well, it's very tragic, really, because almost all of his writing is only in Italian. And the very important book he wrote in 1966 called The Territory of Architecture has only been translated, as far as I know, into French. It certainly doesn't exist in English. And it's really a great loss, I think. There, in that book, Grigotti, rediscovers this German geographer, Friedrich Ratzel, who coins the term anthrogeographic, and makes this argument that, in fact, of course, being has transformed the surface of the Earth all the time, and produces a kind of anthrogeographic pattern out of it. And I think this idea of, and that, of course, leads to the title, The Territory of Architecture. And it leads to this project for the University of Cosenza. And it is I think this is like, like 6,000 meters long. Well, what it is, in fact, of course, is a continuous walkway that links all these lecture halls and faculty buildings across this valley to a rail link here and a road link here. It cuts across this sort of mountain chain. So that's a model of it here, There's the rail link, this is the road link. One wonders, it's a long walk. Of course, it's full of, virile young people, but maybe one would, well, if one had more money, perhaps one would introduce a travelator. But in any case, he got it built, finally, this kind of megaform. And it brings me to this work, which is, by Weiss Manfredi for the Sculpture Park in Portland, where well, what they had to do there is to deal with an existing road system and an existing rail system, and of course disused land between them, absolutely cut off, ruined. And of course the remoteness of the water. And so they devised this very ingenious, now it's, it's a megaform, but also it's a landform in a way. And I'm thinking now of a book published by Stan Allen and Hashim Sarkis with that title, Landform. And it is what it was meant to be, a sculpture park, and also allows, that's the important thing, allows the public to enter from the land side and gradually through a series of ramps come down to have this kind of relationship to the water, while still keeping the freight rail underneath and the autoroute passing underneath. Well, that's an urban intervention for sure. And we see it, well, we see the ingenuity involved in order to create this urban intervention, the fact that one has to create a kind of artificial ground, really. All these sections make it quite clear what the game is. And here you see, well, it's the thing in action, basically. Well, the autoroute, of course, is emerging here. The rail is going under here, and we're coming down. By this bridge, you go down to the river. Here, Seattle. And this is a work by MMBB, young Brazilian team that was at some point led by Angelo Bucci, and in collaboration with Mendes de Rocha. Mendes de Rocha probably should feature much more strongly in this account than he does, because this is the so-called Dom Pedro bus station. Unfortunately, I should have images of it. It's very beautifully designed in detail, but here, well, I think just even an element of this order has a kind of landscape character, urban landscape character in relation to the autoroute game, in the center of the incredible chaos of Sao Paulo. More interestingly, I think, is this project of 2008 by Mendes de Rocha for Paris, which was part of the Olympic bid by Paris for the 2012 Olympics, which it did not get. But part of its bid was this sports boulevard designed by Mendes de Rocha, now acting alone, with all these stadia and arenas of different kinds on top of this podium platform, with a major arena off to one side, playing with the existing water, which is always something which he, as the son of a hydraulic engineer, was constantly involved with. But maybe the real thing is this, See, what I find encouraging is, well, this is the outer periphery, basically. And this is the chaos that, ill-related freestanding objects ad infinitum that surround, the Haussmannian core of Paris. And this is the famous canal, and here he inserts this thing. I mean, it's an other, it is a kind of landmark, a intervention which gives a point of register in what is otherwise, the totally chaotic urbanized region. I don't know how many of you have recently traveled from the center of London to London City Airport, but if one wants to see a total and utter, irrational nightmare produced by, what can we say, by the market, that's it, This work has always fascinated me, and of course, again, another program, I mean, in the case of Mendes de Rocha, it was a sports facility, or in another instance, a bus terminal, or now a ferry terminal, plus actually a brilliant project. I mean, it's one of those, I don't know whether either of the two authors of this project, Zeropolo and Alexander Zeropolo and Farshid Musavi, who actually entered this competition when they were both studying at the AA, kind of doing postgraduate studies at the AA, I think. And they won the competition, and it was built. And I really wonder whether they will ever again equal this this work, you know, this Yokohama ferry terminal. And the amazing thing is that the Japanese built it, of course, you know. And it's very interesting, it was largely built by the Japanese ship industry, in fact. Much of it is made out of folded plate, welded folded plate steel. And, but it combines. It's also a hybrid building. I think that's what is another aspect of this kind of fictive idea of mine of Megaform, is that, you know, the program can sometimes be hybrid, and so that in this building it's not only a ferry terminal, but it's also, again, a park, a kind of belvedere, and a theater. All these things are synthesized into the same building. Actually, it reminds me of an apocryphal aphorism of Le Corbusier, which is, to design you need talent, to program you need genius. And I think, you know, who dreamt up this program is the question. One could ask the same thing about Robson Square in Vancouver. Who dreamt up that program? Or for that matter, Rockefeller Center, in its original form, was certainly a city in miniature from a cultural point of view, still is, I think. And and the other thing that I think is quite, and also somewhat unique, since we've all passed through, maybe still continues, the sort of morphology moment, you know, well, I'm thinking of Zaha, of course, but I could think of others like, well, Frank Gehry, of course, but here, you know, and that's they produced a little book which was very much related to Darcy Thompson's Growth and Form. They produced a book where they tried to create a typology in relation to certain building types that would give them, as it were, a kind of biological format. And here, what I think is extraordinary is the way in which the structure transforms itself. The welded steel folded plate structure transforms itself according to the synthetic content of the program within. And we see it here. I mean, of course, computer-aided design, how else could they have done this, you know? It is absolutely, I mean, it's breathtaking, this wooden deck, and what they do with this wooden deck. And of course, this somewhat sparse green roof. I mean, maybe it's more of a belvedere than it is a park, but nevertheless, it's still a great pleasure. I hear you. Yeah, you get the full weight of the Japanese ingeniousness is right here with this folded plate construction. And in fact, they made all the, I remember going to an exhibition of this building before it was built in the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and there was as part of the exhibition, there was a huge pile of drawings about this high, bound with raffia, very elegantly bound with raffia, and each section in a brown paper cover. And this was the working drawings that the Japanese had produced, because once they'd received the executive drawings from the, which also happened in the case of Raphael Vignoli's, which is also a megaform, by the way, Tokyo, this 5 theatres he built in the center of Tokyo. Exactly the same thing. The Japanese took the information and then redrew the whole thing the way they wanted to build it. Of course, Stephen Hull's hybrid building, now acknowledging its character, built, that's the astonishing thing, built by private developers. I mean, this is hard to believe, you know, who would actually sink geothermal wells in the ground 100 feet. I mean, I can't imagine, where's the American developer who's going to do that, I wonder, you know. And it houses 7,000 people in 2,500 apartments, I think. And with other, and you know, Steve's famous flying bridges, you know, contain exercise rooms and other kind of amenities. And something of the same, of course, is also the Vanke so-called horizontal skyscraper that he built in Chengdu, Shenzhen rather, and which, well, looks back to the mountains on one side and looks out to the sea on the other, and looks like this. I mean, has this idea of providing shaded space. I mean, I don't find this megaform as convincing as the hybrid building, and I want to end with a work by Fumihiko Maki, which is this polytechnic made outside of Singapore in an area called Woodland, which consists of it's called the Republic Polytechnic, I think. It consists of a sort of disc, a green disc, which is elevated, an earthwork, in fact, elevated above the, well, it's a kind of artificial ground. And on this artificial ground are these 11-story teaching blocks. There's a major assembly hall here, which is also accessible to the public and administration and so on, and parking, and staff residential facilities here, gymnasium. But the building, this shows you how it is developed. These are the faculty buildings, in fact, with specialized faculty here, gymnasium, residences, main administration building, and this is the upper plan, showing the greensward and the way these classrooms, they're little sort of teaching towers, in fact, that are above this disc. And so this section shows you the disc like this, which has its own incline. And this colored area here is all the public space underneath, but lit from above, which, so the public space is here in yellow, you know, the space of public appearance, if you like, you know, with here a pool. There are different courtyards that are let down and give light, of course, and air. The little green things are all courts let into the disc on top. So this is the green disc on top, staff residence in the rear, and this is the upper level looking down into the courtyards. This is the courtyard itself, you know, partly with an ornamental pool, partly planked in wood. Or the view from the library onto the courtyard. And the dining hall, you know, with a large window opening to the courtyard. And I think gymnasium beneath. Which brings me to the end, as you'll be happy to hear, perhaps. I want to say, well, this whole idea of megaform as urban landscape begins with this building, in fact, which is in the, I think, 1990, early 1990, by Rafael Moneo and the late Manuel de Sola Morales, very prominent Catalan urbanist. I mean, I think there are two main figures. One is Busquets, who teaches here, and Manuel de Sola Morales, who is no longer alive, unfortunately. And actually, Manuel published an amazing magazine called Ur, and gave, I suppose, I mean, he is also one of the, in some ways, innovators of landscape urbanism, I think. Maybe it's more important to associate his theoretical approach with acupuncture. I love this idea, urban acupuncture, with the notion that strategically placed intervention can have a catalytic effect upon the surroundings, apart from asserting itself as a world in itself, as a kind of world in miniature. And this block on the Avenida Diagonal, shown here, is this famous Ila block. And actually, in this very room, I think, I met Rafa Moneo with a tiny little model of this block. And where the character of the block depends on its serrated top, the character of the block is a landmark, that is. And then the other thing that intrigues me is that, in a way, it is open to reuse, because instead of a curtain wall, you have pierced windows. So you could, in fact, turn what is an office building into an apartment building, I think, without too much difficulty, unlike many curtain wall monsters, which will not allow themselves too easily to be transformed in this way. But the other interesting thing, and it's very hard to see in this rather bad image, there's an existing shopping frontage here on the Avenida Diagonal. And inside this building, well, this shows you it's very schematic, but this shows you the outer limits of the Cerda ensanche of the 19th century, and the ease with which one can get, either on foot or by public transport, to this building. It doesn't really show you the shopping frontage of the Avenida Diagonal, but that it is certainly there, and like we see it, this is the shopping frontage of the Avenida Diagonal, and inside there is this shopping mall. And underneath, very important, is this enormous provision of parking, so that people can drive into this center, this point of urban acupuncture, and park and take elevators up and shop in the shopping mall, and also in the Avenida. This is the shopping mall, also in the Avenida Diagonal. And what impresses me about this, you could say, I mean, all these American provincial towns where the suburban shopping center is built outside, and of course the main street is totally destroyed. That's what's happened in countless American provincial cities surrounded by suburbs, and not only American provincial cities. It's also happened in the UK. This same unfortunate phenomena. And so it's also a program thing, It's not only the form, and the form is important. I mean, this is my point about the landscape, the landmark, the chaos of this is the bull ring in Barcelona, but the chaos of the surrounding, Norman Foster, chaos of the surrounding suburbs are right there. And I think that's the last image, isn't it? No, not quite. This is in Agadir. It's by Vittorio Gagotti. I could, of course, show, Renzo Piano's San Nicola Stadium in Bari. This is a more recent work in Agadir. It is surely as a megaform. Parking is arranged, very similar actually to Renzo Piano's San Nicola Stadium. But the entrances are a bit more cryptic. The whole thing is decidedly more monumental. Again, we come back to a sports facility, a stadium, and so on. And I think probably I've almost come to the end, but not quite. I haven't given this lecture very often. In fact, I think this is the second time I've given it. And I gave it in the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, when I was invited to be the Plim professor there. And so but one of the deals is that every Plim professor has to give a lecture, and it has to be made into a book. So I have, in fact, I've already published the damn book, but it's a bit thin, as this lecture is a bit thin. But I at the end of this, and so what, you know, I mean, there's always the embarrassing thing. So why did I read this? Since 1960, when the French geographer Jean Gutmann first coined the term megalopolis, automotive regional urbanization has become the universal land settlement pattern of late capitalism. Stimulated by the mass ownership of the automobile, megalopoli coming into being all over the world today, accommodating populations of around 20 million apiece in the developing world, and 5 million or so in many North American conurbations. With regard to this last, we may note that some 3 million acres of agricultural land are lost each year in the US through suburbanization, with little or no provision for public transport. That reminds me of Wendell Berry's Unsettling of America, where he points out, you know, that agro-business, what a term that is, you know, cheap food, with the combination of artificial fertilizers and genetic modifications and pesticides, you know, is gradually losing the topsoil of the United States into the rivers and out to the sea. This is book argument made by Wendell Berry already in the mid-60s. The net effect is the proliferation of the non-place urban realm, as celebrated by Melvin Webber in his book Explorations in Urban Structures of 1963. It's interesting that Melvin Webber was in the back room of Llewellyn Forestry, Weeks and Bohr, Walter Bohr being the planner, when they designed Milton Keynes, inaugurated in 1972, the last British new town. And I suppose around the same time, Reston is the last pathetic attempt in the States to do a new town. There was, in fact, a decade before, a new town projected for Hampshire, the amazing town of Hook, which was very beautifully, it would pass muster with Jose Luis Sert's idea of urban design, I think. But that was not built. What was built instead was Milton Keynes, which was like a sort of instant Los Angeles, suburbanized in the end, superimposed, distorted 1 kilometre grid over the previous undulating agrarian land of Buckinghamshire. My second point is, under these circumstances, the stratagem of the time-honoured master plan as an instrument of urban design would seem to be untenable, particularly given the relatively limited resources available for public intervention at a civic scale, along with the volatile rate of spontaneous growth and change in most urban areas. In other words, you know, master plans are already out of date as soon as they are, other than in the case of infrastructures. But even then, I think, you know. Third point is the de facto emergence of megalopolitan patterns of land settlement present us with two alternative strategies as far as future development is concerned. A, the current ad hoc proliferation of ill-related, relatively isolated freestanding objects. Or B, place-creating counter-theses of megaform integrated into a site as a discontinuous exception to the otherwise undifferentiated urban cacophony. It should be clear from this is point 4, from the wide range of megaforms cited in the foregoing that a megaform may come into being at quite different scales and thereby assume distinctly different place-creating potential depending not only on the scale, but also on the programmatic complexity of the form in each instance. I mean, even, of course, low-rise high density, it's now no longer fashionable, went towards a kind of megaform transformation of the environment. The fifth point is, really, of course, megaform can also be landscape itself, as in the case of Enric Marias and Carme Pinos in Igualada Cemetery in Barcelona of 1992, or the Olympic Park, Seattle, 2006 by Manfredi and Weiss. 6 was by definition, a megaform is restricted in its extent. It may thus be realized by the society in a limited time period. I mean, I think that's important because otherwise, of course, nothing gets done. 7th point is, well, I suppose there's a comparison made. I made a comparison to the 19th century arcade. The megaform has the capacity of providing a public domain. This is it, the space of public appearance in what is otherwise totally privatized, processual, commodified environment. 8, within the space endlessness of the megalopolis, characterized by Marc Auger in a wonderful book called Non-Lieu, Non-Place, a megaform may also serve as a landmark, should, I think, must serve in a way as a landmark, such as Polzig's House of Friendship, 1917. 9, it would seem that certain contemporary building programs lend themselves to this idea. Of course, hospitals, universities, maybe air terminals, railway stations, shopping centers, cemeteries, sports facilities, convention centers. And 10, it just says, that, megaforms primarily thought of as interventions in the megalopolis. Clearly, Rockefeller Center being an example can also be applied to historic fabric. Thanks. Yeah, sure, of course, yes, of course.
So Kenneth has agreed to take some discussion. Maybe I could just almost start with your 10 points and thinking about the public issue, because one of the things, that in Boston, Amazon is looking for a place to build Amazon 2, a giant.
Yeah.
Does anyone know the numbers of this? I can't remember. Amazon is proposing to build either near Boston in a kind of peri-urban area or even further out in some of the suburbs, this giant new headquarters. And I can, you mentioned, of course, that most of the projects that you list in the programmatic way are either infrastructural or, giant public gatherings like stadia or terminals or things like that, which in the States right now aren't getting built. But what will get built, at least in the near future, it seems, are these major private corporations, but not even Rockefeller-centered, just like of a scale that's even much bigger. Is there, in your examples, do you recall, is there a way we could hope for something other than a purely exclusive megaform that might result from something like the Amazon project, insofar as everybody in that complex would both be working for Amazon, and I suppose they'd also be living in a kind of town near Amazon, which means they're all more or less the same bandwidth of economics and things like, of income and things like that. Is there any hope of a more diverse? Could the sheer size of these things also encourage a diversity of public in terms of income or other vocation or other ways? Is there any indication for that? I mean, like Yokohama, obviously, everybody in a way has to go through there, because it's an exchange point. But in something like Amazon, the
Right.
private developments, it seems to me the danger is a kind of exclusivity.
Yeah. Just one comment. I mean, I was thinking about Amazon as I put this together. Of course, I've thought about it before, but I mean, if you think of this, well, if you think that the thing that set me off was Ila Block in Barcelona, you know, which combines, there's also a hotel, schools, mainly offices, and this shopping mall, which keeps alive the traditional shopping frontage of the Avenida. Mm-hmm. You know, which could have been done, of course, on a small scale in many other places. But it's interesting. I mean, you focus. I mean, I was thinking about Amazon, and I've thought a lot about Amazon recently. You know that. You know, the aim, of course, is to get rid of shopping altogether, so that the pseudo-public realm of shopping will be eliminated, because everything will be delivered by, you know, that's the project basically. That's the project, and the warehouses in which this stuff is put together for shipment are certainly not public at all. They're just, in a way, they're kind of sweatshops, you know, yeah. Well, that's a pretty black picture. I totally concede. It's a totally black picture, but it's interesting how, you know, in effect, I at the end I cite the Ila Block in Barcelona, but Ila Block in Barcelona, if Amazon is given its full scope, will be destroyed. Of course, you know, its function won't operate anymore.
Mm-hmm. But maybe I don't know if the sheer size, because you mentioned, you know, as soon as you start saying, okay, they're going to need hotel, they have to have family visit, they are going to need, I mean, it's also interesting that Amazon bought Whole Foods, so they are aware of a food industry that's not the one you described it's a different kind of agribusiness, right? I mean, it's still agribusiness, but it's slightly different. But maybe the sheer size means that there have to be other functions and adjacencies that would bring in different classes, different colors, different, I don't know. So.
Yeah, but you need someone with a brain, like Olivetti, Adriano Olivetti, Comunita, you know, the whole project of Andrea Olivetti before the Second World War and immediately after, you know, in Ivrea, you know, that was a Saint-Simonian idea, right? I don't think there's, you know, there's no indication that Bessos has a Saint-Simonian bone in his body, right? I mean, I mean, the Italian industrialists, or let's say, you could say that Olivetti was, you know, anachronistic. I mean, it's not an accident that we're comparing him to Saint-Simon. I mean, he's almost like a 19th century figure that ends up in the 20th century creating, well, this magazine, Communitas, the whole Ivrea business. I mean, and therefore a total community. It's a concept of, right? But I don't see Bessos getting around to that, do you?
Take this opportunity to ask Kenneth questions, comments. Lane.
Thank you. Okay. I would like to put in comparison the idea of Megaform with another idea which is popular in the school about the archipelago, which certainly has like a long history, but has been most recently elaborated by Aureli. And like if we understand the Megaform as being critical because of its scale and its singularity against the logic of urbanization, in order to make place and give potential for landscape, that sort of thing, it's at the same time also like a product of neoliberal accumulation at a vast scale. So I wonder how this idea of the archipelago, which seems to me like irreconcilable with the scale nature of Megaform, the archipelago tries to, or is seen as, because of its fragmented nature, establish a kind of like agonistic life in the city. But I wonder what you think about the fragmentary small-scale potential of the archipelago to resist urbanization as something which obviously has to operate in a very different way from the large scale of the megaform.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And, you know, I think that the question is, how do you activate the political constitution of these fragmentary parts of an archipelago? You know, I mean, I'm someone who's very admiring of Spanish architecture after the demise of Franco. And I think the quality of this architecture depended upon the vitality of the Spanish city-state, both as a political and cultural entity, you know, which was, they didn't go into building megaforms too much. Well, they built a few stadia, but if I understood what you implied by the term archipelago, I think that if you can't constitute the space of appearance, you know, you can't really develop a culture that has real political strength and identity, I don't think. So, I mean, in some ways, critical regionalism was about that, I think, in the way, anyway, the kind of twist that, if you like, or the way in which I sort of adapted it from the Zonis Lefebvre original formulation of the term critical regionalism. And one of the things which is always left out, not by Friedrich Jameson, by the way, who wrote a critique of it, very actually brilliant critique, is the cultural political implications, you know. I mean, he wrote a critique from a very hard Marxist standpoint, which threw doubt on the cultural and political viability of such entities, you know. Well, and that's really why I sort of introduced the idea of city-state, which of course, you know, we don't have city-states. And it's interesting that Margaret Thatcher, you know, neoliberal coming to power in the UK, would destroy the power, the fiscal power also, of British provincial cities, to concentrate all the power in London and to weaken them as any kind of political opposition or cultural and political independence. I mean, attempts have been made to repair that, but that was the game, clearly.
Someone else? Can we get it? You're right in the middle.
Thank you for your talk. My question is rather simple. I'm curious if you have anything to say about accidental megastructures versus these structures that have plenty of authorship and thought embedded in them.
Well, can you give me an example?
For example, Kowloon Walled City in China, or perhaps one could consider urban sprawl happening in underprivileged areas as megastructural accumulations or neighborhoods, and where the authorship doesn't seem to have a direct source. There's still the same type of social coherency existing inside them.
Well, maybe that, of course, is a clearer, for me anyway, at this moment, clearer formulation of the idea of archipelago. But, of course, you don't really need architects for that, in fact. I mean, you know, it's interesting that Rudolphi's Architecture Without Architects is 1964, you know. Happens to be very close to the date of Shemaev Alexander's Community and Privacy. And you know, this kind of vernacular, in a way, you know, barriada favela, spontaneous housing is a kind of vernacular, doesn't need architects at all. people build their own environments. So, the profession has what do architects do? I mean, John Turner's book, makes it clear that architects should only be involved in, adding or somehow administering the provision of sewage or electrical power or something. But apart from that, I mean, forget it. The people know you can't intervene, really, basically.
And authorship's a funny word because something of that size is going to be a huge collaboration of different dimensions of architecture, engineering, different kinds of planning. It won't be all. I mean, Gregotti is an author in the sense you're using it, but I can, like Amazon, it's not clear yet if they're going to use architects, right? They have their own designers, and it won't be authored in that sense. It'll be
because a continuation on that question, on this concept of authorship, whether it's a state or a private entity like Amazon, there's a certain organization within that structure that's required to initiate a project of a megaform. So I think that could be a whole other lecture maybe about what are the organizations required to execute those types of projects.
I don't know exactly what the archipelago idea is, but the one thing I would ask the two of you to comment on or the students, is the question of disconnect, because I think what Ken was talking about, in fact, is about connection, right? It's about taking fragmentation and connecting it to something that has, that's more embedded, let's say, in a city, in the different dimensions of a city. When you have these structures that are built not by design, they're often quite disconnected. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if we should be glorifying that disconnection, or maybe we're overly glorifying the connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in a way they are connected because people, at that level of survival, depend on each other and build their houses like almost on top of each other, I think.
There's a question here, and then Bam next. Here and then.
Sorry, it's kind of related, going off of this sort of connection and disconnection. But, if we're talking about Megaform as a landscape, as something that can begin to connect all these diverse entities, how can we begin to think of Megaform as a kind of like processual or incremental construction, rather than, this huge, large-scale kind of like capitalist entity, something carried out by such a huge entity? Or, if it's not carried out by this capitalist entity, does it not necessarily make it a megaform anymore?
I mean, I deliberately... the whole thing is what can you do under capitalism, basically. Because I'm someone who thinks, as someone said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And architecture is a bourgeois profession in the end, it is. And, and the profession is at the service of capitalism because we don't live in a socialist society. So I showed these, I'm interested in this kind of large-scale intervention as providing some indicator of a place, both in terms of its landmark qualities, but also in terms of the kind of space of appearance that it provides inside it. And at different scales, as a compensation for a placelessness and no space of appearance, basically, a privatized, commodified society under capitalism. I think it is like that.
Ben maybe has the last one.
Well, this is totally related to Oh my God,
No.
but anyways, whatever.
This is related to the last couple questions, and it's just a comment, basically. I think the most powerful notion that you put forward is that precisely all of these architectural projects operate as totally discontinuous from the urban fabric. How something which asserts itself as a sort of like autonomous, figural, iconic object is in fact perhaps the most urbanistically instrumentalization at that scale. I think one of the earliest ideas of an urban project was to unify Rome with these obelisks, and they are in fact, not immediately productive in terms of the spatial scale that we normally consider in terms of architecture, but they are extremely productive as a sort of processional, experience through the city. And that relates back to your original comment about freeways being completely, useless without, signs. That's just a comment.
No, I think you got it. I mean, I think that's the case. Yeah, I mean, the idea is this idea of intervention as a kind of compensation for what is otherwise absent, the placelessness, in fact. Of course, I know within the placelessness you can find little corners here and there which have a kind of unique character, but the general drive, in terms of these 20 million cities that I cited, is a production which is indifferent, really, to any idea of the urban. And your comment about obelisks made me think of Argan wrote a little book called The Renaissance City, and he begins the book by saying, we can't say the Renaissance city never existed. What existed was the medieval city into which were inserted Renaissance monumental pieces. He gives Florence as a classic example of this, Brunelleschi, etc., etc. And so, yes, the idea of I suppose, that notion, we can't say the Renaissance city didn't exist. I mean, it relates for me to Mises' comment, that's why we can't do cities anymore. We can't do planned cities, etc., etc. It goes on like a forest.
But we can do the monuments. We can do the obelisks.
Yes, you can do interventions. The question is, what is the intervention? To borrow Manuel de Soler Morales' metaphor, what kind of urban acupuncture, what kind of project can one imagine and also launch somehow or other in a society like this? I mean, it's of course problematic. I know it's problematic, but the lecture has this particular character because I'm somehow preoccupied with this question of where is the public realm, How does any kind of public realm come into being?
Just one quick thing that I was thinking about these last few questions. The thing you emphasized that might go some way of answering the incremental question as well as the archipelago question, the dominance of the ground plane and the need for a continuous ground plane, even if the buildings are aggregates, the ground plane itself is somehow needs to be continuous for a proper megaform to emerge. And I think there's some beginning of some kind of answer. It's also going back to the landscape urbanism relationship that provides a continuity even when the buildings aren't continuous. That seemed to be important. So
One last comment, which is that, the golden lane, as I showed at the beginning, You know, the street in the air is obviously a huge problem because it's not a street, you know. And it's totally disconnected already from any kind of continuous fabric, you know.
So I heard the rudiments of at least 6 thesis projects there. And one of the great things about Kenneth's work, again, is inspiring in very different ways, either to go against and refute it or to learn from it. So it was so valuable for us, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.